But there's a whole research process here where researchers create data, whether it's from machines or surveys or their brains or whatever. They discard heaps of it, they process it again, and at some point they develop their insights and they publish something, hopefully with some associated data going with it, and it goes into repositories. It might be institutional repositories or learned institutions, or it might be some of those ones. That first diagram all sounded very straightforward. The reality is that the way researchers work is completely chaotic. And one of the challenges of research data management is to recognize that reality. And I think one of my underlying messages is there's a real danger in the IT community and maybe in the library community to think that there's a simple, straightforward answer if only we could find it. And if only we could convince people that this is the way to do it. And I just don't believe that that is realistic. Partly because of the way researchers work, but partly for some of the other reasons that I'll share in a minute. And I thought, let's just have a look at the scale of what we're talking about here. So, if we just look at Birmingham, we've got an institutional repository, it's very lightly used, 3,000 objects in it, which is nothing. We've got a special collections system that looks after special books and things like that, 50,000. For the ref, we're dealing with 75,000 publications. We're using Pure. Interestingly, the extracts that come from things like Scopus and PubMed and stuff like that have almost no metadata in them. So we're already at the point where there's very weak support and structure for managing the data. Look at the library system. We're currently in the process of changing from TALIS to Ex Libris. We're talking about a couple of million objects, of which about 250,000 I think are electronic. So most of those are still physical assets. Let's have a look at research data. So if I just looked at the 100 largest stores in Birmingham, we're talking about 700 million objects. Half a petabyte of data. You get into different scales, gigabytes, petabytes, terabytes. Zettabytes is the next one, in case you're wondering. And there's a load of things that aren't in those 100 stores. We all know researchers keep things in USB sticks and external drives and servers under the desk and all the rest of it. So managing research data is about managing this scale. And any one of those 700 million objects could be the kind of thing that gave the University of East Anglia some of its challenges with environmental data. Any one of those objects could be FOI'd, like Queen's experience with tree rings. So there's a scale challenge and if you also look here, we've got some systems here. When we get to research data, we haven't got systems. You know, it's folders. There are no systems in place typically which are trying to capture, generate, receive any metadata information. So scale is a huge issue. So I think my first conclusion is that we are going to need differing approaches for curation of research data. And the data can have many different statuses depending on whether it's published, processed, analysed, discarded, if it's what are the characteristics of the information, has it patient information and pupil information, and are there security requirements that mean it has to go in a particular place. And in doing all of this, we have to create an environment that researchers don't run away from. You know, one of the academics in Manchester spoke at the Russell Group last year about this. Her phrase is that she wants to get rid of the IT people in the middle, the disintermediation. She just wants researchers to be able to get on and do what they have to do without IT or librarians or whatever getting in the way. So we have to make it very easy, almost encouraging for researchers to use whatever systems and services, better than doing it themselves or even doing nothing. Now, let's have a look at how research communities work. Now, research isn't something that happens in an office or a lab in university. It happens as part of a community. And they will be multi-institutional, they'll be international. And they all work differently. Astronomers don't work the same way as social scientists or historians or archaeologists. And there are different models for how they handle the data. If you look at the CERN thing, there's a huge international infrastructure that takes the data that comes from the Large Hadron Collider distributed to national networks through to universities. Right now, for example, in Birmingham, our network link for the physics people is 5 times the size of the network link for the rest of the university. I mean, the sheer volume of information that's coming down there is huge. For other disciplines like bioinformatics, they use a hub and spoke model. So the European Bioinformatics Institute, the EBI, is one of 3 global hubs, US, Japan being the other ones, and they hold the genomic information for published research in that area. They've been going for 40 years, and they've got 20 petabytes of data. But they have a different model. And just imagine trying to suck some of that petabyte information down if you wanted to do something with it. And other disciplines have got little structure at all. It's kind of point-to-point personal relationships. If we have a look at some of the European communities for research, I think Stephen mentioned earlier that it's not just the scientists. There are groups across a whole range of areas, and each of these groups has got a different way of working. And I mean, just to give you an example, Chiara is the physicist, these are the nanostructure people, Alexa is the bioinformatics. And they use hundreds of tools. They use different tools. So each of those communities decides, tell you what, we're going to use this little facility that Heidelberg is using, and that's where we're going to record all our information. So there's no commonality there on the tools, and it's growing. So you end up with these discipline repositories that the discipline decides we're going to hold things in a particular place or in a particular way. So there isn't going to be a single solution, and I think it's really naive, and I think I started out thinking, what's the answer going to be for Birmingham? There isn't going to be an answer for Birmingham that does all of this. There isn't even going to be an answer for the UK that does all of this, because we're in an international world. So we have to be able to cope with many different systems. And that probably means that we have to think more about the principles of research data management rather than the detailed practical incarnations because so many of them. And data management, or metadata management, is something that is dear to all of your hearts, I'm sure. But that is really challenging. Some of those communities can't even decide amongst themselves between 6 or 7 different metadata standards. So to think that we're going to have one big definition of metadata that applies across all the disciplines is just unrealistic at all. So we've got a challenge of scale, we've got a challenge of very different disciplines wanting to operate in different ways. Let's have a look at the government view in all of this. So there's been a drive from government for quite a long time towards opening up information. Freedom of Information Act 2000 is active legislation, so it evolves with case law. And we've seen some of that with teaching materials in Lancashire, with say Queens and stuff like that. There's a new bill, the Freedom of Information Act, now says the data must be machine readable. And that's not just PDF, it's got to be machine readable. So there are quite some consequences in these things. So we've got this group, the Public Sector Transparency Board. Francis Maud has got a bit between his teeth. Apparently he passed up other positions on the cabinet because he wanted to keep going on this one. And it's all about driving forward the transparency agenda. And there are a number of different things, and I only found out about some more of these only in the last week. But a lot of these things have got a very weak or sometimes non-existent voice from higher education. So the PVC for Research at Birmingham is the only academic voice on that open data user group. So it's the people who dominate these are the people that want to access the information, industry, commerce. They want to get at all of our information as cheaply, as freely as possible so that they can then go and exploit it. Under that, there's a Research Sector Transparency Board, and that's a little bit better. We've got 2 PBC's Lynn Gladden is from Cambridge, I believe. But the message there is still the same. There's people like Tesco and all the rest of it, and they want access to all of our wonderful research. And really, what's open access, and as I say, there will be many in here who know more about this from a publication point of view, but in terms of data, what it's gradually crystallizing into is the data associated with published material. It could have been all research data that's publicly funded, but thankfully we're not there. And there are timescales assumptions. So if it's biomedical, that it will be available within 6 months of publication. If it's STEM-based, within 12 months, anything that's 24 months. And will continue to be available for 10 years afterwards, or 10 years since the last request of access. So there are huge obligations to keep this stuff available for an awful long time. There's an awful lot going on the commercial front in terms of the APCs, who's paying for them, are you going to be able to claim for them in grants or not? And some funders say yes, some say no. I think universities themselves will probably start to think about, are we going to pay for this particular material to be published? So the working assumption of research is that everything they decide to publish will be published. Maybe won't hold in the future. The business models of publishers, so Elsevier and all the rest, would think, okay, here's more money. But then some people think, well, maybe I don't have to subscribe to Elsevier because a lot of the material will become free 6 months later. So there are quite some toings and froings going on there. And I think we need to watch that space. Clearly, we all spend a lot of money with these publishers, and we don't have lots of spare money knocking around. I mean, it runs into 6, 7 figures, the kind of impact that this could be for Birmingham, for example. And there are technical challenges from the IT world. Genomic information is the one that people usually talk about, where you're generating like 300 terabytes of data. And interestingly, that community is starting to think about, I'm not going to back up the data, I'm going to back up the sample. I can always rerun the genomic sequence. But if you think of video for art or social sciences, you can't rerun the video. So in some senses, some other types of data are even more challenging. Probably many of you will have gotten involved in some of the requirements that have come from funding councils, EPSRC being the leading one. We were all asked if we were in receipt of EPSRC funds by May last year to put together a plan for how we will be compliant with managing research data for all of their funded work by May 2015. So we've got 2 years to get it done. So we have to be doing go. In some form or another, it is going to happen. It's just a matter of what form will it take. We've got a lot to do. We've got to decide on which repositories, recognising that kind of very diverse world that already exists. We have to decide what data is actually going to go into those repositories. Is it published data? Do we have to hold on to discarded data, for example? Or those kind of things. Researchers need to be acting and looking after this. I've got a bit of a view that somehow we need to create an insulation layer so the researcher puts the object into the layer, and the layer works out where to put it, depending on the characteristics. And if the characteristics of the object change, the layer takes care of moving it to the relevant repository. And that sounds great in theory, but it's mind-blowing to try and make that happen. And international collaborations are a particular challenge, where if we're collaborating with an overseas institution, like an American institution, America's kind of going the other way. How do we handle that if the data is shared? So we've got some balances to strike. We just can't be purist. We've got to comply with what the funders want, otherwise we won't get the funding in the future, and we can't live with that. It's got to be easy to use. We've got to safeguard IP. And in the middle of all of that, it's very, very dynamic. It's very, very changing. And it's not easy to actually know and keep up to date with what's going on. So within the Russell Group IT directors, we held a workshop last October. We had a lady from EPSRC that actually came and shared her view on things. Adam Tickell, our PVC, gave an update at the time. And we kind of recognised that this isn't just an IT thing. Yes, there are lots of IT challenges, but actually the challenges are much greater than that. And there are people with many different skills, expertise and perspectives that need to be involved. So following that, what we concluded was that we should set up a special interest group to try and bring people from those different communities together so that we can collectively understand the challenge, and that also that we have the ability to give feedback through to the Research Sector Transparency Board and to other groups, so that it's not just a one-way street and they can understand the practical consequences of what they're asking for. It's not trying to do the open access bit that probably you guys are doing. So this is about the data aspect of open access rather than the publication side. But clearly the two things have to be linked. And these aren't specific, but one of the things that I'm looking for are volunteers, nominees, whatever, from you lot to come and join that group. We've got nominations, although I don't have any of them with me, from the IT side of things. So it would be good to have, I guess, representatives from other universities who aren't from the IT side. We also want to connect in with the research groups, and there's an outfit called ARMA that we want to connect into.